Good day. Today remains a holiday period in Russia and to some extent in Ukraine, connected to the May Day holiday. So news from those parts of the world is thin. To the extent that I can get any particular clues about what is happening, it does seem as if the war is progressing very much in the direction that it was in which it was going before the May Day holidays began. But today, rather than discuss the actual fighting on the ground, which, as I've said before, others are in a better position to do than me, I'm going to focus on the collapse of the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Now, briefly, after the Russians began what they call their special operation in Ukraine in February, in other words, after the Russian army entered Ukraine, in what the Ukrainians perhaps justifiably refer to as an invasion, the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, began negotiations with each other. And there were a series of meetings in Belarus and in Turkey between the negotiating teams with a view to coming to some kind of agreement between the two countries and with a view to drawing up a peace treaty. Well, that lasted until the end of March, when the Ukrainians did come forward, as I discussed in previous programs, with a proposal which appeared to accept that Ukraine would never join NATO, would become a neutral country, would seek security guarantees from various states, including Russia and China, would agree not to host foreign military units on Ukrainian territory or conduct exercises with foreign military units on Ukrainian territory without Russian agreement, and in which Ukraine also took its first tentative steps to recognizing that Crimea and Donbass would not have the same sort of rights as other parts of what Ukraine claimed as its own territory, with Crimea and Donbass specifically not being included within the security guarantees that Ukraine was seeking. So it did seem for a short time as if negotiations were heading towards some kind of positive outcome, or at least some kind of outcome which might have restored peace to the country. And then what happened was that the British government and the US government, both alarmed about Ukraine's concessions, telephoned Zelensky, contacted the Ukrainian authorities, told them to draw back on all the concessions that they'd made in Istanbul, and promised them in return large amounts of military equipment, supposedly in order for Ukraine to win the war against Russia. And in the next few days and weeks, it became clear that Ukraine had indeed rejected or withdrawn all the concessions that it made in Istanbul. And the Russians have expressed deep frustration about this, and they've also spoken out about Ukraine's failure to negotiate in good faith. And of course, the sequel now is we've had a whole series of statements from various Ukrainian officials in which they talk about outright victory. They talk about Russia either changing its government or facing its own breakup. Extraordinary claims. They've come from the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, and they've come from other Ukrainian officials as well. And the extraordinarily belligerent comments from Danilov, the head of the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, it's been confirmed that they've been to some extent endorsed by President Zelensky himself. Now, it's impossible to see these actions as being divorced from enormous Western pressure on Ukraine in order to get it to pull back on its concessions to Russia. And of course, it is linked to this vast amount of weaponry and financial and other aid which is supposed to be flowing to Ukraine from the Western powers. This enormous $33 billion spending package that the United States is putting together. We've had further reports that the United States now believes that long-range artillery, the 100 howitzers that it is delivering to Ukraine, are in and of themselves going to be a strategic game changer, that they're going to change the entire course of the battle. The Russians, for their part, have picked up on this extraordinary hardening of the Ukrainian position. The deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, has now published a statement in which he says that it's now clear that Zelensky is not prepared to negotiate, that he's not ready for peace, that he's not interested in peace, and that in fact war is his only real policy. So it looks as if negotiations have now once and forever collapsed. It does seem that the negotiating teams remain still in formation, that they're still exchanging policy positions or views. They still remain in virtual contact, but there is no suggestion of any follow-up meeting to the one in Istanbul. There's no suggestion of any substantive talks. Talk that of the Turks are still floating, of trying to set up some kind of meeting between Zelensky and Putin, are going absolutely nowhere. So this means the war in Ukraine is going to continue. And the talk in the West is of war lasting months, years, well, who knows how long. Now, I have to say, I think this is all a tragic and disastrous mistake. First of all, I think it's always a mistake to go for war when you are in a position to achieve a strategic compromise. Now, as I've said many times, Donbass is a distinct area. It doesn't want to be part of post-2014 Ukraine. And of course, Crimea certainly doesn't. Crimea conceives of itself as entirely Russian. And it looks increasingly as if Kherson region, Zaporozhye, other places will be switching towards Russia as well. So this idea that Ukraine has some sort of principled right to reconquer or reoccupy these countries, this seems to me to be fundamentally and radically wrong. But why is this happening? Well, I'm going to suggest that it is part and parcel of a long history of utter Western intransigence on the topic of Ukraine. So firstly, we had a situation way back in in the period before the Maidan events, when the Europeans, the EU, tried to force upon Ukraine an association agreement which would have in effect severed its long-standing economic relations with Russia. And the then Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, had second thoughts about this agreement. He wanted to suspend its ratification. He suggested talks between the EU, Russia and Ukraine to find some sort of workable compromise. The EU adamantly refused. They said that the association agreement had to be agreed without any change at all. Not even a punctuation mark could be changed. And in fact, as we know, the EU and the United States instead backed protests against President Yanukovych in Kiev, which eventually resulted in his violent overthrow in an event which I personally have no hesitation in referring to as a coup, given that it was clearly unconstitutional, but which the Western powers unanimously and indeed enthusiastically backed. Then, in 2014, when it became clear that the overthrow of Yanukovych was going to result in an uprising in eastern Ukraine, we had a whole series of complicated negotiations. There was a meeting between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, over the course of which Kerry appeared to agree that some sort of federalization of Ukraine might be a proper way forward. But then, of course, that was retracted as well. There was talk, there was a meeting in Normandy with Putin, Hollande and Merkel. There was talk about some kind of negotiations then under what was then called the Normandy 4 package. But of course, as I've discussed in previous programs, that came to nothing. Ukraine launched an offensive as well. Instead, we've had the Minsk 1 agreement and the Minsk 2 agreement, which Ukraine never implemented, despite it being confirmed by a UN Security Council resolution and partly negotiated by Germany and France. We've seen an astonishing catalogue of bad faith in relation to negotiations with Ukraine, in which the Western powers seek always a maximalist outcome in Ukraine, appear to reject any idea that Russia has any right to opinions about what happens in a country that neighbours upon itself and which includes vast territories of historic Russia. And instead, we've now had a situation in this year which has resulted in all-out hostilities between Ukraine and Russia. Well, I think this collapse of the negotiations is going to be a clarifying moment. I think that the Russians, up to this moment, have believed that some kind of settlement between Ukraine and Russia, eventual settlement, was possible. I tend to share the view of others like Gordon Hahn, the analyst, and also Gonzalo Lira, who's appeared many times on our live streams, that part of the intention of the special operation, the Russian special operation, and part of the intention of the deployment of Russian troops close to Kiev was to try to pressure the Ukrainian government to reach some sort of workable compromise. I think that the fact that Ukraine is now showing that it is not prepared to reach any kind of workable compromise with the Russians, that it instead persists in believing that Western promises of economic, military and financial aid will somehow rescue it from its predicament. I think this is now going to harden Russian feelings, and Russian feeling even more. Now, over the last few days, we've had a series of reports in the Western media from Western governments, from the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, that the Russians are going to escalate their special operation in Ukraine, that President Putin is now considering some form of some sort of full-scale mobilization of Russian forces in order to bring this war to Ukraine to an end on Russian terms. Well, I have no idea whether or not that is true. I don't know what information Ben Wallace is getting. I suspect much of it comes from the kind of commentaries and discussions one sees on Russian television media especially. I do get the sense, by the way, that a great deal of the commentary that one is seeing in the West about Russia is based on misunderstandings of some of the debates and discussions that do take place on Russian television especially. But regardless, it's not impossible, in fact, it's highly likely that faced with the situation, the Russians, concluding that negotiations are going nowhere, will indeed step up their operation. Or it could be, instead, that they will continue going very much in the way that they're going at the moment. I read on the Moon of Alabama website, this is the website that's operated by the former German military officer who I only know as Bernhardt. I read an extract from the Agence France Presse, in which a journalist from Agence France Presse has dealings with some Ukrainian troops who have been fighting in the front line near ETHEREUM. And it confirms something that I've myself been noticing from many of the films and pictures that I've been seeing over the course of the fighting. Not only is Ukraine suffering exceptionally heavy losses, but Ukrainian troops on the battlefield are increasingly old. Many of them seem to be men in their middle age, and frankly, not in particularly good shape. Now that begs the question of why. Is it the case that most of the young men have fled, or that many of them have been killed? I mean, why is Ukraine increasingly throwing middle-aged, even elderly men into battle if it has young ones? Could it be that these people are being treated as cannon fodder, that they're being hurled into battle because the younger men, the fitter men, are being held back to defend places like Odessa and Nikolaev, or to prepare some kind of counter-strike force that will supposedly drive the Russian invaders back? All I would say is, if it's the second, it's a grotesquely callous and ruthless calculation, which I have to say straightforwardly seems to me to beg even more questions about the morality of this war and of the way in which it is being fought. Or could it be, and this I have to say does seem to be more likely, that with these enormous losses that Ukraine does appear to be suffering, it is indeed gradually running out of reserves. It's important to say that the biggest battle fought in this war up to now has been the battle for Mariupol, which Ukraine has lost, and lost with heavy losses. There are still, as we know, Ukrainian troops hiding behind the Azovstal factory, but the outcome of their fight is not in doubt as they increasingly run out of supplies, out of food. And of course, we've been hearing more and more reports from the front line, from the troops in Donbass, many of whom are Ukraine's best trained and best equipped troops, that their position is becoming increasingly desperate as well. So it seems to me that the Russians might decide that they don't have to mobilize further, that they can continue with their special operation, much as they have been doing. And by the way, I'm also hearing further reports that since phase 2 began, since the Russians have begun incremental offensives backed with heavy artillery fire and all the rest, that they feel that their losses, that Russian losses, have shrunk very considerably, and that the Russians are no longer losing men or material to any very great degree. I'm going to add something further, which is, I suspect a lot of the Western calculations about this war continue to be based on these grossly inflated figures for Russian casualties, which have been floating around and which have become almost sacrosanct in Western media commentary. Little regard seems to have been given to the fact that back on the 25th of March, the Russians only confirmed losses, deaths of 1,300 men, far from the thousands, the tens of thousands that the West was talking about. Now, I suppose the assumption is that the Russians are lying about their losses, but for the record, at that time, as of that time, I don't think so. And if Russian losses since the start of the Donbass war have been far less than many people in the West believe, then the whole premise upon which the West appears to believe that Ukraine can hold its own or might even win is obviously shown to be false. And in a program I did 2 days ago, I discussed the extent to which the war in Ukraine seems to be now following much of the same pattern as the war in Vietnam. And I also discussed yesterday the extent to which the war in Vietnam was completely corrupted and distorted in terms of US policy by body counts, claims about body counts which were wrong and which gave a completely exaggerated picture of Ukrainian losses, just as I suspect the West is misleading itself about Russian losses in this war. I suspect many of these claims ultimately derive from Ukrainian claims, and I would have thought that the recent admission by Ukraine that the whole Ghost of Kiev story was a fiction ought to have acted as a cautionary note and should have told the West, or at least the Western media, that there is a very heavy dose of propaganda in many of the claims Ukraine makes about what is going on in the war. So, given that this is so, we have made in the West a series of disastrous mistakes. They're going to set us in a much longer war of attrition in Ukraine, with no guarantee that Ukraine is going to win. In fact, my conviction remains as before, that on the contrary, what is happening is that this is going to result steadily in the piecemeal destruction of Ukraine. As for the idea that long-range artillery, 100 howitzers, is going to be a game changer, again, I have lived through many wars. I've seen Western commentaries about many wars, and I repeatedly remember cases of how Western governments, Western militaries, Western media have hailed particular weapon systems as being game changers in particular war-type scenarios. And it never turns out like that. The only real game changer in any conventional war would be nuclear weapons. And I hope nobody is thinking of providing nuclear weapons to Ukraine. So this idea of sending howitzers, 100 howitzers to Ukraine, doesn't seem to me as if it's going to make any realistic difference. It's only going to provide more artillery pieces for the Russians to destroy. And I gather there's already concern in the United States that what's happening with all these huge supplies of Western weapons, of US weapons, to Ukraine, is that US weapon stocks in certain critical fields are becoming depleted, and things are not turning out as and will be difficult in time to replace. Well, there we go. There we are. That's how things look to me. We are, it seems to me, trapped now in a situation of indefinite war. At least that's what the plan seems to be in the West. The Ukrainians once again have been led down what Professor Mearsheimer called the primrose path to ruin. It's astonishing the extent to which the Ukrainians continue to be influenced by Western promises which never materialize into real action. Anyway, I wonder where all this is going. In the meantime, all the indications are that in the West, we are heading into a very serious economic crisis indeed. Inflation is taking hold. The stock markets, the financial markets in the United States and in Europe have registered serious decline. Living standards across Europe are falling, and it's inevitable before long before we start to see contractions in economic activity right across the West. We've already seen that in the first quarter in the United States. So we're going to be heading into an economic contraction, a severe economic recession. We are locking ourselves into a situation of elevated energy prices. And of course, the talk about oil embargoes on Russia, which, as I've predicted, look all but irresistible, seem guaranteed to make that worse. Meanwhile, the popularity of Western leaders is falling. Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Britain looks like he's going to suffer electoral losses in local elections this week. This despite the fact that the Labour opposition is all over the place. In France, it's clear that President Macron, despite his recent election, continues to be deeply unpopular, And there now looks a real possibility that the left-wing parties, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, somebody who, by the way, is opposed to NATO, extension of NATO and the Ukraine war, that the left is going to sweep to victory in the legislative elections in June. I'm not going to discuss what the implications of that will be in this program. In Germany also, there's growing criticism of Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, and growing stresses, as I suspect, within the German coalition and between its various component parts. And of course, in the United States itself, there are now all the indications of a further escalation of the culture war, with pending US Supreme Court decisions on all sorts of, shall we say, sensitive topics, and also with President Biden's popularity sinking as the economic situation deteriorates within the United States itself. The latest opinion polls that I've seen suggest a massive sweep by the Republicans in November, though what the intensification of the culture war will do about that remains to be seen. Anyway, we are looking, it seems to me, at a deteriorating economic picture, a deteriorating political picture, but a political class in the West which still remains obsessed with Russia. And let's be absolutely clear about this. Its obsession is with Russia. It is much more obsessed with Russia than it is interested in Ukraine itself. Ukraine is being sacrificed. It is being destroyed in order to see through this objective. It is very disappointing, to put it mildly, that the Ukrainians themselves have once again been led down this particular primrose path. My expectation, about which I'm confident, is that they're going to discover in a few weeks' time that all these new flashy weapons that they're getting from the United States are not going to change anything. Going all the way back to the Indochina War between France and the Viet Minh, I can remember how the French military in Vietnam was supplied with all sorts of flashy new American equipment, how American officers and officials, if you read the histories, you'll find all of this, were saying, that the French were going to win, and all that resulted in was the French disaster at Dien Bien Phu. And this has happened time and again in war after war. The South Vietnamese government in the 1960s found itself caught up in the same way. So did in the same way did the Afghan government recently. The Iraqi government was also supplied with all sorts of flashy new weapon systems, and it was defeated. It suffered major blows when it faced against ISIS in Mosul and had to be rescued directly by the United States in a de facto but never admitted alliance with Iran. So we see that Western weapons never make the fundamental difference to the outcome of wars in the way that people expect. All they do is that they prolong the wars, but they never change the outcome. And I predict the same will be true of the war in Ukraine. Well, there we are. We are, it seems to me, now in a situation where negotiations have irretrievably broken down and failed, where war is now the only future, where economic attrition will continue to exact an ever deepening and aggravating cost. And I suspect it will take many months, years probably, before wiser, more rational counsels finally prevail. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on YouTube and of course on Rumble and Locals, where you'll find links under this video. Remember, if you're watching our videos on Rumble, you can go to the red maroon button at the top, press that button and that will take you directly to our locals homepage, where you can join our locals community and become an active member, participate in things like my Wednesday live streams, for example. And you can also join us on other platforms as well. ODYSEE, SuperU, for example, links under this video. Also, don't forget that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hoodies, our hats, our bomber jackets, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And of course, don't forget that you can also support us by ticking the like button to my videos and by checking your subscription to this channel. Despite the bleak news, I hope that you all have a good holiday if you're enjoying the May Day holiday, and if not, well, I wish you well anyway, and have a very good day, and I look forward to you joining me again soon.